Welcome to China's Living Legends.
欢迎来到我的频道。
I want you to start off today by, well, imagining a scenario that, if it happened right now, would seem completely and utterly impossible.
Oh, totally impossible.
Right. Picture this. It's the middle of tax season here in the United States. You're pulling together your W-2s, your receipts, you're stressed out.
As we all are.
Exactly. You go to look up a rule on the IRS website, and you see a message from the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. But, the Commissioner isn't an American citizen.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The head of the IRS, the person with absolute authority over the massive financial institution that runs the country's tax collection, is a foreign national. Let's say a French citizen.
That is wild to even think about.
And it gets crazier. Not only are they a foreign national, but they've held this position, wielding total, unbroken control over the nation's finances for 50 straight years.
I mean, the psychological leap required to wrap your head around that thought experiment is just staggering.
It really is.
Like, if you're listening in the UK, try to imagine the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Right? The person carrying the famous red dispatch box.
Exactly. Imagine the person carrying that box being an American who holds that office for half a century. I mean, in any modern sovereign state, handing over the absolute core of your financial sovereignty to a foreigner fundamentally breaks every established rule of how a nation-state operates.
It sounds like the plot of some bizarre alternate history novel. But you know, the reason we're asking you to imagine this is because it isn't fiction.
No, it actually happened.
Today, we are taking a deep dive into the historical archives, the economic data, and the sweeping institutional records of the late Qing dynasty.
We're exploring its drastic, fascinating, and frankly incredibly painful transition into modern finance.
Yeah, and our mission today is to really unpack the sheer stakes of this transition. We're exploring how a massive, millennia-old empire completely flipped its financial foundation just to survive an absolute existential crisis.
Right, and at the center of this survival story is how an anomalous, foreign-run institution didn't just collect taxes, but actually became the gold standard for modern administration in China.
It allowed an ancient empire to finally step out of its traditional shell. But wait, identifying that this happened is one thing, right? Understanding how it was even tolerated is a whole different story.
Oh, absolutely. We are talking about the late Qing dynasty here.
Right. For a lot of people, the immediate image of the late Qing period is the open door era. You know, the empire's doors being forced open by foreign power.
Treaties being signed under the barrel of a gun.
Exactly. Foreign influence just flooding in. And if we had to pinpoint this open door period to one specific physical and administrative entity, it would undoubtedly be the customs office.
Yeah, the importance of a customs office to any nation goes without saying. I mean, it's the valve that controls what comes in, what goes out, and how the government gets its cut.
The lifeblood of trade.
Right. But during the late Qing dynasty, due to a highly complex web of historical pressures and forced concessions following the Opium Wars, the Chinese customs office ended up being managed by foreigners.
Which is just nuts to think about.
It is. And the most prominent among them, the absolute titan of this era, was a British man named Robert Hart. He managed Chinese customs for nearly half a century.
Half a century?
Yeah.
And the paradox here is just striking. You have a situation that starts off looking like the ultimate imperial humiliation, right?
Oh, for sure.
A foreign national managing the empire's customs duties right after his home country just fought a war against them.
Yeah, the optics are terrible.
Yet Robert Hart managed this institution so exceptionally well that his customs office became the most efficient and the least corrupt bureaucratic institution in all of China at the time.
It's true. The very institution that symbolized foreign intrusion simultaneously set a completely new benchmark for modern financial management.
Which is such an irony.
It really is. Under Hart, the customs office became this well-oiled machine operating inside a broader imperial system that was otherwise struggling deeply with administrative decay.
So to give everyone listening a sense of scale, we really need to look at the money. Because, you know, efficient is a pretty vague word until you attach silver to it.
Right. Let's talk numbers.
During his tenure, Hart grew the customs revenue from just over 4 million taels of silver to over 40 million taels.
Wow. A tenfold increase.
Yeah. Now, for context, a tael isn't just a coin. It's a weight of silver, roughly 1.3 ounces.
Okay.
To put that into perspective, in the late 19th century, a single tael of silver was enough to feed a peasant family for a month.
That really puts it in perspective.
Right. And a lower-ranking imperial official might officially make 40 or 50 taels a year. So Jumping from 4 million to 40 million taels meant Hart was suddenly handing the emperor enough silver to fund modern navies, build arsenals, and pay off massive national debts.
It's game-changing money. Its share of the empire's total fiscal revenue jumped from under 10% to over 30%.
Incredible.
And because he was generating this staggering amount of reliable revenue, Robert Hart cultivated an excellent relationship with the Qing government. I mean, he wasn't just tolerated, he became absolutely indispensable.
He was the guy keeping the lights on.
Exactly. Which leads to one of the most fascinating historical footnotes of this entire era. After his death, the Qing court posthumously awarded Hart the title of Grand Guardian of the Heir Apparent.
Okay, hold on. We are painting Robert Hart as this immaculate administrative saint, but let's look at the political reality for a second.
Sure.
He is still a British national extracting wealth from China right after Britain forced them into a humiliating treaty.
That's true.
So there had to be massive domestic resentment. Like, I'm trying to think of an analogy. That would be like the U.S. giving the Presidential Medal of Freedom to a foreign official who was auditing our taxes.
That's a great analogy.
So how did a foreign official not only survive in a famously intricate and likely hostile imperial bureaucracy, but actually become beloved enough to enter the pantheon of imperial honor? Like, how did the local Chinese officials tolerate him?
Well, that is the crucial tension right there. Hart survived politically because he fundamentally understood his position. He insisted that he was an employee of the Qing Emperor, not an agent of the British Crown.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so when British diplomats tried to order him around, he pushed back. But more importantly, he survived because he structurally insulated his office from the rest of the bureaucracy.
Insulated it how?
Building an efficient office in an environment where corruption is essentially, the operating system takes more than just being polite. It requires rigorous administrative engineering.
Right. If institutionalized corruption, like the kickbacks, the bribes, the skimming, is basically the operating system of the empire, how did Hart actually build a firewall around his office?
He had to be strategic.
Because if a powerful local magistrate demands a cut of the silver from a mid-level customs clerk, how does that clerk actually say no without losing their head?
Right, so he built that firewall by drawing upon the institutional experience of Britain, which at the time was overhauling its own civil service. One of his primary institutional designs was a strict mechanical separation of powers within the bureaucracy.
But
he cleanly separated political officials from administrative officials.
mechanically, how does that actually protect the clerk on the ground?
Well, in Hart's system, the political officials, meaning the traditional Chinese mandarins at the Zongli Yamen.
Which functions sort of as the foreign ministry, right?
Exactly. They held the political responsibility. They made the broad policy decisions. They dealt with the imperial court. And they took the heat if things went wrong politically. But they were strictly forbidden from touching the money or hiring the staff.
Ah, I see.
The administrative officials, meaning Hart and his customs staff, held pure management responsibility. Their job was strictly execution. Inspecting cargo, calculating tariffs based on a printed, unchangeable public ledger, and collecting the silver.
So if a local magistrate threatens a customs clerk for a bribe, the clerk doesn't have to negotiate. They just point to Hart. And Hart points to the Zongli Yamen.
Right.
It completely removes the local power dynamic.
Exactly that. Furthermore, Hart introduced highly rigorous modern accounting. In the traditional Qing system, records were often kept in local shorthand.
Making it super easy to hide discrepancies.
Exactly. So Hart introduced standardized dual-language printed manifests. He implemented cross-referencing, so the manifest of a ship leaving Shanghai had to perfectly match the manifest when it arrived in Canton.
Very smart.
And he also constantly rotated his inspectors between different ports, so they couldn't put down roots and form corrupt local cartels.
Okay, so that handles the auditing side of things.
Right.
But you still have to deal with human nature.
Always the trickiest part.
Right, because the hardest problem in imperial financial management anywhere in the world was squeeze. You know, the hidden fees.
The cost of doing business.
Exactly. In the traditional system, every middleman took a cut because official salaries were practically non-existent. Like, an official might be paid 50 taels a year, but it cost him 5,000 taels to run his office and pay his own staff.
Right. So squeeze wasn't just greed, it was structural necessity.
Exactly. So how did Hart fix the human element?
He fixed it by completely reinventing how public servants were compensated in China. He provided his staff with high salaries, often 10 times the going rate of a traditional official.
10 times.
Yes, along with generous guaranteed pensions. And he paired this with strict performance-based retention.
Okay, that's huge.
He completely bypassed the traditional imperial examination system, which tested candidates on ancient poetry and Confucian classics.
Which doesn't really help you audit a shipping ledger.
Exactly. So he instituted his own exams focusing on math, geography, and modern languages.
So the secret to ending institutionalized corruption wasn't just deploying undercover inspectors or executing corrupt officials.
No, not at all.
It was treating the administrators like highly valued professionals. If you pay someone a poverty wage, you are basically guaranteeing they will extract bribes just to survive.
You're forcing their hand.
Right. But by paying a massive salary and guaranteeing a pension, Hart completely flipped the risk-reward ratio. The risk of losing that incredibly lucrative job and a secure future far outweighed the short-term temptation of taking a few taels and a bribe.
It was a profound psychological shift. If you look at this setup, it is essentially a Chinese replica of the modern British civil service.
Oh, totally.
For anyone who has ever watched the classic British sitcom Yes, Minister, this dynamic will sound incredibly familiar.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the division of labor. In Yes, Minister, you have elected politicians, the ministers, who panic about the press, worry about optics, and take all the political risks. But the real execution lies with the permanent civil servants. These unflappable professionals who use their expertise to run the actual machinery of the country, almost entirely insulated from the political drama.
That's spot on. In the late Qing Dynasty, the politicians at the Zhongli Yamen acted like that rotating cast of ministers. They interfaced with the imperial court and foreign ambassadors, absorbing all that political friction.
While Robert Hart's custom staff were those ironclad civil servants.
Exactly. Because of their independent status, high pay, and rigorous auditing, they couldn't be easily shaken down.
So we have this beautifully engineered, airtight administrative machine, a well-run office immune to the traditional imperial rot. But an efficient tax office is only half the equation, right?
Right. The machine needs fuel.
Exactly. And the kind of money they were collecting had fundamentally changed. It wasn't just that they were better at collecting the same old taxes. The actual mechanical nature of the economy was shifting under their feet.
It really was. And it's vital to recognize that customs duties didn't just suddenly materialize out of thin air in the 19th century.
Oh, sure.
The concept of saying you are moving goods through this checkpoint, pay a toll, is ancient. I mean, during the Warring States period, the empire levied inland customs duties on goods circulating domestically.
Right.
And during the Tang and Song dynasties, specialized agencies like maritime trade bureaus collected taxes on imports and exports at major ports.
So the framework was already there.
Exactly.
But the late Qing customs tax exploded from a secondary revenue stream into this massive geyser of silver. And that was the direct consequence of the treaty ports opening after the Opium Wars.
The scale completely changed.
Right. Because when you connect Hart's ultra-efficient machine to the massive global commercial economy forged by the Western Industrial Revolution, the numbers just go exponential.
And what's truly fascinating here is how the mechanical shift from a local agrarian economy to a global industrial economy completely neutralizes traditional forms of corruption and market manipulation.
Ooh, walk us through that mechanism. How does a global supply chain defeat local corruption?
Well, consider how business was traditionally done. In the imperial era, commercial taxes were based entirely on natural, agricultural, and local handicraft goods.
Like silk and grain.
Exactly. So a very common tactic for a wealthy local merchant cartel was to simply hoard those goods. They would buy up all the local grain or all the locally produced silk, lock it in storehouses, and create artificial scarcity.
Right, to drive up local prices.
Yes. And by doing that, they gained massive leverage over both the local populace and the tax collectors. They controlled the reality of that specific local market.
Because in a closed, slow-moving system, whoever controls the immediate physical supply basically holds all the cards.
Exactly. But that manipulative tactic is totally useless against a massive global network. I mean, you cannot effectively hoard cotton textiles to drive up local prices when an entire fleet of steamships might arrive in Shanghai the very next morning, carrying 10,000 tons of mass-produced, industrially manufactured cloth from Manchester.
Right. The sheer volume, scale, and speed of the global commercial economy just shattered those localized monopolies. It's the difference between trying to control a local pond versus trying to dam the ocean. The local strong-arm tactics just evaporate in the face of industrial scale.
They don't even register.
And this brings up another massive shift, the actual identity of the taxpayer. You were moving from taxing peasant farmers or local merchants to taxing incredibly powerful Chinese compradors and Western international conglomerates.
The power dynamic completely inverts.
It really does. Think about the leverage. An 18th century peasant farmer has zero leverage against an imperial tax collector. If the collector demands double the grain, the peasant either pays, starves, or starts a rebellion.
Terrible options.
Right. But an international global merchant fleet, companies like Jardine Matheson, they have literal warships backing them up.
And international treaties.
Exactly. They possess incredibly high negotiating power.
And powerful merchants with high negotiating power demand predictability above all else. They were perfectly willing to pay customs duties, but they demanded those duties be standardized, documented, and transparent.
They wanted a printed tariff sheet, not an arbitrary negotiation at every single port.
Which perfectly aligns with Hart's system.
It really does. The merchants wanted a predictable tax, and Hart built an airtight, predictable system to collect it. Because of that alignment, this new customs tax was highly unlikely to devolve into the arbitrary shakedowns that commercial taxes in the imperial past had, well, unfortunately become.
Yeah, and the steady, predictable, massive stream of revenue from global trade arrived at the exact moment when the empire needed it most.
It was perfect timing.
In fact, the math became so overwhelmingly clear that it forced the empire to do the unthinkable. Abandon a financial strategy it had successfully relied on for thousands of years.
The existential math. Let's really look at the numbers that forced this pivot, because they show a staggering structural flip in the empire's financial DNA. Let's do it. Let's contrast two specific years. First, 1766, during the reign of Emperor Qianlong. This is often considered the peak of the Qing Golden Age. At that time, the land tax, which means taxing the agricultural output of the peasantry, accounted for 72% of the empire's total fiscal revenue.
That's a huge majority.
Right. Customs and salt taxes combined were just 20%.
So in 1766, it is an overwhelmingly agrarian empire. The state's survival is fundamentally tied to the harmony and productivity of the dirt, the land, and the peasant.
Yes. Now, fast forward to 1903, during the reign of Emperor Guangxu. The pie chart is completely inverted.
Completely.
The land taxes plummeted from 72% down to just 34% of total revenue. Meanwhile, commercial taxes, so customs, salt taxes, and new transit taxes, soared to make up 62% of the total revenue.
It's a massive structural shift.
It is. The traditional core of the empire, the land tax, was no longer keeping the lights on. Why does a mature, millennia-old empire abandon a tax system deeply tied to its Confucian identity?
Well, short answer is a crisis of national survival. The traditional finances simply could no longer generate the volume of silver required to keep the state alive in a hostile modern world. If we look back to the early Dogwang reign, before the major crises hit, the traditional land tax system was actually functioning adequately. The treasury generally ran a healthy surplus.
But then the Opium Wars shatter that equilibrium. And it's not just the cost of fighting the wars, it's the cost of losing them.
Exactly.
The Qing government was forced to pay staggering war indemnities. Mechanically, what does paying a massive war indemnity actually do to an agrarian economy?
It causes a devastating macroeconomic cascade. When the king had to pay millions of taels in reparations to the British and French, that silver physically left the country. It was loaded onto ships and taken to London or Paris.
Just totally gone from the local economy.
Right. And this massive drain of silver caused severe deflation in China.
Because there's suddenly less silver circulating in the local economy, the value of the silver that remains goes up.
Precisely. And this ruined the peasantry because of China's bimetallic system. Peasants conducted their daily business in copper coins, but they were required by law to pay their land taxes in silver.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So when silver became scarce and its value skyrocketed relative to copper, a peasant suddenly had to sell twice or three times as much grain just to get enough copper to exchange for the required silver to pay the tax.
That's devastating.
The tax burden effectively doubled or tripled without the official tax rate ever changing.
That is a brutal, hidden mechanism. The peasants are being squeezed dry by international currency fluctuations they can't even see.
Exactly.
But a slow bleed from foreign indemnities is one thing. You could theoretically try to borrow your way out of that. The thing that actually stopped the empire's heart came from the inside, didn't it?
It did. The final nail in the coffin for the agrarian tax system was a domestic catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. the Taiping Rebellion.
We really need to slow down and look at the mechanics of the Taiping Rebellion, because its sheer destructive scale is often hard for modern minds to grasp.
It's unbelievable.
It happened roughly concurrently with the American Civil War, but it was fundamentally different in its impact on the nation's economy.
The death toll alone sets it apart. Estimates range from 20 to 30 million casualties.
It's just staggering.
But for our discussion on finance, the critical factor is where the rebellion took place. It started in the south, violently pushed its way up the Yangtze River Valley, and eventually occupied the city of Nanjing for over a decade. And in doing so, it completely devastated the Jiangnan region.
And the Jiangnan region is essentially the Mississippi Delta, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street of imperial China all rolled into one. It was the agricultural breadbasket and the absolute center of silk and textile production.
It was the economic engine that paid for the empire. To make the loss of Jiangnan visceral, imagine if a modern nation suddenly lost its greatest economic drivers overnight.
Right.
It would be like the United States permanently losing the entire economic and agricultural output of California and New York simultaneously.
Unimaginable.
Or Europe, watching the Rhine-Ruhr industrial region burn to ash. Furthermore, by controlling Nanjing, the Taiping rebels physically cut off the Grand Canal, which was the central artery used to ship tax grain from the wealthy south to the capital in Beijing.
So the wealth is destroyed, and the delivery mechanism for whatever is left is severed.
Exactly.
That isn't just a budget deficit. That is an amputation. When Jiangnan burns, the land tax doesn't just dip, it essentially vanishes.
And facing this existential death, the government initially panicked. Before they fully committed to Hart's modern customs system or new commercial taxes, they desperately tried traditional short-term band-aids to bridge the gap.
I want to spend some time on these failed band-aids because they perfectly illustrate what a dying economic system looks like. One of their first moves was to aggressively expand the sale of official titles.
Right. They essentially auctioned off government prestige and rank for immediate cash injections.
Which is like trying to heat a freezing house by burning the floorboards.
Yes, exactly.
Sure, it gives you a burst of warmth today, but you are destroying the foundation of your home tomorrow. By selling titles, they diluted the prestige of the scholar official class, angering the elites who had spent decades studying for the imperial exams.
Alienating their core supporters.
Right. And they put power in the hands of wealthy merchants who often just wanted to use those titles to extract more wealth from the locals. It corrupts the entire political fabric.
Another desperate band-aid was the manipulation of the currency. The government began minting heavily debased, oversized coins, like the infamous Xianfeng large coins.
Explain the mechanics of debasing coins in a peasant economy, because it's not just a subtle accounting trick. It's an aggressive tax on reality.
Well, in a healthy bimetallic system, a copper coin is worth the metal it contains. But the Qing treasury realized they didn't have enough copper, so they took a small amount of copper, stamped the number 100 on it, and passed laws forcing the population to accept this new coin as being worth 100 of the old standard coins.
They're essentially trying to print wealth by declaring it exists, but you can't fool the market.
You absolutely cannot. Gresham's law kicks in immediately. Bad money drives out good money.
Right.
People hoarded the old valuable coins and tried to spend the new worthless ones. Merchants refused to accept the debased currency, or they instantly jacked up their prices by a factor of 10 or 20 to compensate.
Makes total sense.
It triggered massive hyperinflation, particularly in the cities, leading to food riots and completely destroying public trust in the state's financial competence.
The traditional band-aids, selling titles, debasing currency, and just blindly ordering local governments to extract more from a ruined populace, they failed spectacularly.
They made things worse.
Right. They actually accelerated the crisis.
Right.
It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the old agrarian framework was dead. They absolutely had to find entirely new ways of generating revenue.
And this is where the pivot to commercial taxation became permanent. We already discussed the Maritime Customs under Robert Hart, but they also introduced a massive internal commercial tax called the Lijin, or Likin.
This was essentially an inland transit tax. But how oppressive was it mechanically?
Oh, highly oppressive to domestic trade. Local authorities set up toll booths and checkpoints every few miles along major rivers and trade routes. A merchant moving tea or silk across 3 provinces might have to pay the Lijin tax dozens of times before reaching their destination.
Wow, that would totally eat up their margins.
Yeah, it significantly stifled domestic economic growth, but for a desperate state facing total collapse, it provided immediate crucial revenue.
They also fundamentally shifted the salt tax, right? Instead of relying on a complex, corrupt licensing system for salt merchants, they moved toward more direct taxation.
They did.
And as the late Qing period bled into the Republican era, they began aggressively importing a whole suite of modern industrial and commercial taxes from the West.
Yeah, they observed how Western nations enriched themselves through commerce rather than just agriculture. They introduced taxes on tobacco and alcohol, stamp duties on legal documents, business taxes, income taxes, and inheritance taxes.
It's a total revolution in how the state conceptualizes wealth, and the raw numbers resulting from this desperate pivot are staggering.
They really are.
We noted that around the time of the Opium Wars, the Qing government's annual revenue was about 40 million taels of silver. By 1910, driven heavily by these modern commercial taxes, the Lijian, and the explosive growth of global trade at the ports, that revenue had soared to over 300 million taels.
An almost eightfold increase in state revenue during a period characterized by intense national humiliation, territorial loss, and internal chaos.
It's an incredible feat of survival. I mean, it was ugly, it was agonizing, but it worked.
It kept the lights on.
It kept the machinery of the state functioning. And this brings up a truly fascinating philosophical question about history and survival. We know history is a graveyard of empires that faced massive existential crises and simply collapsed.
Right, they couldn't adapt, so they shattered.
Exactly. Why did the late Qing, despite all its deep structural flaws, manage to use this immense pressure to evolve?
To answer that, it's useful to look at a theory proposed by the British historian Arnold Toynbee regarding external challenges and the development of civilizations.
Okay, what did he say?
Toynbee argued that external pressure can stimulate a society to develop and adapt, but there is a very delicate balance. He suggested that the most stimulating challenge is to be found in a mean between a deficiency of severity and an excess of it.
So a nation needs to find a historical Goldilocks zone of crisis.
That's a great way to put it.
It needs exactly enough terror to force it out of its complacency and compel structural change, but not so much terror that it is instantly annihilated before it has the time to adapt.
A Goldilocks zone of pressure is the perfect way to frame it. To see this mechanically, we can compare the late Qing to an earlier Chinese dynasty, the Southern Song.
Oh, interesting comparison.
During the 13th century, the Southern Song faced external pressure from the Mongol invasions. That pressure was so overwhelmingly excessive, a military force intent on total conquest, that it didn't act as a stimulus for internal reform. It directly crushed them. The state was wiped off the map. By comparison, Toynbee's framework would suggest that the external pressure on the late Qing was relatively moderate.
Wait, I have to push back hard on the word moderate.
I thought you might.
Let's review the apocalyptic laundry list we just discussed. They lost multiple foreign wars. They paid crippling indemnities that drained their silver. They had their sovereign ports forced open at gunpoint. Their economic heartland, Jianyan, was burned to the ground with tens of millions dead. How can any historian look at that and call the pressure moderate?
I agree, it is a jarring word and deeply counterintuitive when looking at the human suffering. But we have to understand how macro-historical theory measures catastrophe. Moderate here does not mean mild, it means survivable. It is strictly relative to total, instantaneous obliteration.
Ah, I see the distinction. The Mongols wanted to conquer and govern the entire territory. The British and French in the 19th century didn't want to govern the Chinese interior. They just wanted highly favorable trade conditions and open ports.
Precisely. The foreign powers wanted a functioning Chinese state that could collect taxes and pay back war indemnities and loans. And while the Taiping rebellion was devastating, it was an internal civil war that the Qing military, with some foreign assistance, was eventually able to put down.
So the pressure was agonizing, but it wasn't instantly fatal. It was a slow, continuous burn.
And because they weren't instantly annihilated, that continuous severe pressure acted as a massive historical stimulus. It forced the Qing state to make choices they never would have made in peacetime.
Right.
It forced them to hire foreign experts like Robert Hart, to abandon the millennial-old agrarian land tax, and to build the foundations of a modern commercial fiscal state to meet these relentless challenges. It was exactly the right amount of severity to force a complete financial transition without entirely breaking the state apparatus.
It's the crucible of history. If the fire's too hot, the metal just vaporizes. If it's just hot enough, you can forge something completely new. To bring this deep dive to a close, let's just recap the sheer magnitude of what we've uncovered today.
It's been a journey.
We started with the bizarre anomaly of a British man running the Chinese customs office. We explored how he insulated his staff with high salaries to defeat institutional corruption. We tracked the shift from taxing local peasants to taxing global steamship fleets.
The whole system shifted.
And we saw how the devastation of the Taiping rebellion forced the empire to abandon its agrarian roots and build a modern commercial tax system.
It's a stark demonstration that when faced with absolute existential failure, when the traditional heart of a nation stops beating, adopting global systems and executing massive structural pivots are the only mechanisms for survival.
It is an incredible story of adaptation. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a lingering thought to mull over. We spent this time seeing how leaning on the customs tax and integrating into the global commercial economy literally saved the empire from financial ruin. It was the life raft.
It was indeed the life raft. But we must also consider the hidden cost of the rescue.
Exactly. If your single largest category of tax revenue relies entirely on foreign trade, foreign shipping, and international merchants, many of whom are backed by foreign gunboats, what does that actually mean for your sovereignty?
It's a huge question.
If your financial lifeblood is controlled by external global forces, how does that impact your long-term independence, your domestic development, and your ability to truly control your own destiny? It is a profound tension between economic survival and national sovereignty.
And it is a tension that didn't just disappear when the Qing dynasty finally fell. The echoes of that structural dependency are highly relevant when analyzing global trade and developing nations today.
It's a fascinating paradox to ponder the next time you think about taxes, global trade, and the true hidden costs of national survival. Thank you for taking the plunge with us into today's deep dive. We'll catch you next time. If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.